O sea, es como formal.
Lo pongo en modo presentación.
Sí, no, encuentro F11. Creo que no. Respecto.
Para que se vean grandes. Ahí. Ya. Gracias.
Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend Risto Conte, who is visiting Chile and also will give a talk on environmental disasters at health there. Risto earned a PhD in sociology or social and political science at the European University Institute, and currently is a postdoc researcher at the Max Planck, and a member of the Computational Demography Lab at the Max Planck. And Risto is moving forward a research agenda that is very innovative, studying at the intersection between global warming and environmental crisis and its consequences for educational and economic inequalities.
Thanks a lot, Mauricio, for the introduction and for the invitation to present today. It's a great pleasure to visit the campus. It's very nice and to meet everyone here as a partner. And yeah, the topic of today is related to alpha birth and wildfires in Spain. And yeah, Mauricio already made the introduction, so I spare your time with this. But as he was saying, my PhD was mostly looking at climate change, air pollution, inequalities, exposure, and vulnerability. And the motivation for this research is related to the fact that my main goal is to understand what is the impact of climate change on human health and well-being. And so far, most of the research I have done was mostly focused on temperature. So we know that in the past years, the number of hot days has been increasing globally. And this is mostly related to anthropogenic climate change, so human-induced climate change, so CO2 emissions and so on. And what I've started doing recently as well is to focus on wildfires. That there is less research compared to temperature that has been growing a lot. But recently there's lots of interest on looking at wildfires. And for example, here I was looking at the context of Chile and found out that recently this year, there was one of the deadliest and largest wildfire happening, and happened in close to Viña del Mar, and then spread out all the smoke in the neighboring areas as well. So it seems that, yeah, many parts of the world, this is an important concern. And why is this field of research growing in recent years? For example, here you can see the research that's been published on climate and health only in Europe, but the pattern for other parts of the world is similar. In some countries a bit less, in some more, on the topic. So you can see that from the 1990s, in the 1990s, there was not a lot of research on the topic, but especially after 2005, about that years, it started to grow a lot in the European context. And one of the main drivers that led to this, let's say, growth in interest in climate change and health was the big heat wave that affected Europe in 2003. So I've estimated that in 2003 in Europe, about 70,000 people died because of this heat wave. And after that, a lot of research has been done on this topic. So there is lots of relevance because we know climate change is affecting different health outcomes. And most of the research, you can see, is also related to the impact. So to estimate how much this is a problem for human health and other outcomes as well. But this is also driven by the fact that there is way more data today to do this kind of analysis. So temperature data for the whole world is available at a very fine resolution for many different places. And this enables them to estimate how extreme temperature affects, for example, certain outcomes. And similarly, air pollution and other types of exposures are more and more available to be used. And similarly, there are methods that allow them to estimate better the impacts of these types of like environmental factors on health or sociological outcomes. So this is the trend in the past years. However, there is a big gap in the literature. That's the one that I'm interested in, that is related to the fact that, for example, when they showed this graph, they say that only 2% of the studies in 2022, so one of the years in which you see lots of research happening, only 2% of these studies referenced words related to equality, equity, or justice. So it seems that it's a bit neglected. And this is mostly studies from epidemiologists, let's say, or public health researchers. But even in sociology, climate is not a big topic, even though climate change is present everywhere. For example, in a recent study that was published this year, they were looking at the top US sociological journals and showing that less than in the past, let's say, 15 years, from 2006 to 2022, and less than 1% of these publications were related to climatic factors. So both, let's say, in the health domain, equality is not a big thing, and also in sociology that should study inequality, it seems that there is not a lot of emphasis on this. And the main, let's say, interest is then to understand how climate change impacts populations and if individuals are equally at risk of suffering the consequences of climate change-related environmental hazards. And the usual framework that is used to understand the inequality is this one that's from it was published in 2008. It is related to heat, but one could use it also for other stressors, also like air pollution, for example. And the understanding is that heat, at the beginning, to determine heat stress, you need to be exposed to it. So there are inequalities in the likelihood to being exposed to, for example, heat. One could live in a city center where it's hotter, and some other people could live in more rural areas where it's cooler. And that makes that there is inequality in exposure to these types of stressors. Air pollution is similar in that regard. But then once people are exposed to heat, they are not sensitive to the same extent to the negative consequences of heat. Some individuals might have some existing health conditions that make them more likely to suffer the consequences of, for example, air pollution or heat. And some others might be also more likely to be protected in some other ways. And once individuals suffer even equally the consequences of certain environmental exposure, then there is also access to treatment that might be not equal in the population. And this, when it comes to heat-related death, that determines that there is inequality on who basically dies when there is a heat wave happening. And then there is this mix between, let's say, environmental inequality, environmental justice, showing how social inequalities are also tightly tied with the environmental inequalities, and they could, let's say, basically enhance one and the other. But yeah, the paper that we'll be discussing today is on environmental disaster and health adverse evidence from wildfires in Spain. Is co-authored with Maria Rubio Cabañas from the Universidad Risto Conte in Madrid. And the two questions that we were interested here are, how do wildfires affect birth outcomes in Spain? And if there are differences in this impact by socioeconomic characteristics. And when it comes to wildfires, it's a bit of a story of progress to a certain extent, but also of increasing risks. So, for example, on the left graph, you can see that from 2000 to 2020, there has been a decrease in the amount of burnt area through wildfires. If you go even back in time, in some areas from 1980 to nowadays there is less area burnt by wildfires. And this is mostly due to progress in the forest management that led to basically manage better the forest in a way that wildfires are less likely to happen. However, when we think about the weather patterns, there is an increase in the past years and expected also in the future of fire-conducive weather days. So it's becoming more drier, and it's becoming hotter. And that means that when a wildfire happens, can be quite disruptive for the territory. And that it's also more likely that this happen. And the research on wildfires, as I was saying before, is less developed compared to, let's say, temperature impacts. But there are already some studies showing that there are different outcomes affected. For example, there are many studies looking at, for example, how wildfires affect short-term migration, so displacement when this happens, where people go, or also in the long term, how much this affects, let's say, individuals in terms of like how they want to migrate to other places when they're affected by it, and also estimating how many people are killed by wildfires in certain territories. And there are also several studies looking at hospitalizations. We see an increase in respiratory diseases and then hospitalization because of that. But also mental health is a big factor there, because people can be scarred mentally by the experience of living close to a wildfires or experiencing it firsthand. And then, for example, studies showing that they're more likely to take antidepressants after these events. And also there are a few studies now looking at birth outcomes, because these are also expected to be affected by this. And there is also one study looking at test scores in the US showing that students affected by wildfires are then performing worse at the end of the school year. And interesting as well, wildfires are particularly problematic. So air pollution, we know for many studies is bad for health, but it seems like wildfires, because of the exponentially increase the amount of air pollution in a very short amount of time, and also by other factors, these seem to determine a health impact that's worse than other types of particulate matter types of air pollution. And when it comes to birth outcomes, then we know from several research that perinatal health is a critical factor, and they can have also long-term implications when it comes to educational attainment, income, and so on. And we know as well that many types of environmental exposures in pregnancy affect birth outcomes. For example, there are many looking at the stress-related factors or air pollution or heat, for example. And similarly, wildfires have been shown to increase negative birth outcomes. And the mechanisms that explain this are mostly two. One is the fact that air pollution is increasing because of wildfires. So the individuals are affected to higher levels of, especially PM2.5 is the main type of air pollutant that people focus on, because the particulate matter 2.5 are smaller particles that then penetrate more in the lungs, and they are more negatively affecting health of people. So, and we know from lots of epidemiological research that air pollution negatively affects birth outcomes. And the other possible pathway is stress. So if you live close to wildfire, it might determine stress that we know also is negatively affecting birth outcomes. And this could be related to factors such as people are displaced, they have some sort of like anxiety related to the risk of it. And also, in some cases, they might have less access to critical infrastructure, I don't know, to do some checkups and these kinds of things. And as talking before, also in this case, one could think about these three main mechanisms determining also socioeconomic inequalities. One factor could be exposure. So some people might be more likely to be living close to wildfire-prone areas, or to be less likely to change their behavior in a way to be less affected by, for example, the air pollution determined by a wildfire. And similarly, existing health conditions could determine higher susceptibility to this impact, or also determine inequalities in the access to healthcare and support. So in a way, also in this case, inequalities early in life determined by inequalities in exposure to wildfire could determine in social inequalities throughout the life course afterwards. But compared to other types of literature, the evidence so far is quite mixed when it's showing SES patterns and the exposure to wildfire. So most of this existing research is on the US context, so it might be different because of that. And what some studies show no SES patterns when it comes to the impact of wildfires. Some others show maybe low SES mothers being affected during the first trimester and the high SES mother being more affected in the third trimester. So it's very mixed. It's not so clear-cut as with other environmental exposures. And thinking about the context of Spain, as there has been progress, as I was showing you the map before, also in the Spanish context, from 1980 to 2020, the hectares burned by, let's say, total yearly by wildfires has been declining a lot. And that's mostly because in the 1980s, they had huge wildfires, and then they implemented policies to manage them. And that meant that there might be quite a strong improvement in decreasing these events. But there are still some challenges. For example, recently, a newspaper article in El País was showing how, yes, there are less wildfires, but when these happen, they are bigger than before. So whenever there is one, it seems like this is becoming more problematic and bigger. And also this might be related to this more likelihood of having this fire-conducive weather as well. But there is lots of research on the wildfires and health outcomes in mostly Australia, US, Brazil, but other contexts in the world, I haven't seen many studies. Even for Europe, there are not so many. So in this case, we were interested in seeing how, for example, wildfires can affect Spain. That's also the country that is more prone to wildfires. So if in Europe, Spain, Greece, and Italy are more at risk of it. In Sweden, they had a big wildfire in 2018 and 2014, but these are rare events, so not so much happens usually. So for this study, we use data from the Spanish Statistical Institute, and here you can see colored by the number of births, the municipalities we have in the data. So a restriction of the data is that we could only have data on municipalities with more than 10,000 inhabitants. And that meant that we only have 768 municipalities, but these are the largest. So we still have 85% of the total births happening. And we have then 3.5 million births from 2008 to 2021. And we are focusing on birth weight, so as a continuous variable, and then also a categorical variable, low birth weight, is categorized as 1 if the birth is below 2,500 liters. And the wildfire data that we use is from the European Forest Fire Information System. So for all of Europe and also Northern Africa, they use satellite data to basically create like maps of areas that have been exposed by a wildfire. And also they provide information on how much area has been burned and the type of also land that was burnt, if it was vegetation or buildings or things like this. And in Spain, they classify wildfires in, if it's less than 1 hectare as an attempt, between 1 to 500 as a fire, and as a large forest fire, those that burn more than 500 hectares. And we focus on this large one here. And then in the map, you can see where they are located. So they're mostly there in the northwest and scattered a bit around, and also there is a bit many in the, let's say, central eastern part. And we basically classify as a mother being exposed if during pregnancy they were affected by one of these large forest fires. And the methods we use basically to estimate this is an OLS for the model with the birth weight and the linear probability model with the binary variable for low birth weight. And we have controls for many different individual characteristics of the mothers. We have age, education, birth order, newborn sex, and singleton. And then, as I was saying, the exposure of interest is the binary wildfire. And then we control for example, temperature, as there might be some factors related to temperature during pregnancy as well that could affect. And we have a fixed effect for the specific municipality, month, and year of birth. So the idea is to then understand the relationship between wildfire during gestation on birth outcomes, compare births within the same municipality, accounting for seasonality, year trends, and other possible biases related to the characteristics of the mother. And then we interact the wildfire exposure with a measure of SES that's based on educational attainment of the mother. So low education, those that didn't achieve high school degree, those that completed high school degree are then medium SES mothers, and then those that got university degree are classified as high SES. So getting to the results, here you can see the results for the true outcomes and being exposed to wildfire. So we observe a decline in birth weight. It's not statistically significant, of about 4.7 grams. And then we observe an increase in the likelihood of being born birth weight of 0.4 percentage points. And comparing this with other studies, it seems to be, let's say, a lower bound for birth weight. Something to note is that studies looking at exposure to wildfires, they use different thresholds as well when they classify large forest fires. For example, in this here, they were focusing on way bigger forest fires, and this might be the reason for this large effect size. But this seems to be, but for low birth weight, it seems to be closer to the existing research. Looking at the results by trimester, so if mothers were more likely to be negatively affected in the first, second, or third trimester of gestation, we observed that the effect seems to be concentrated in the third trimester for both birth weight and low birth weight. And the effect size here also becomes larger than looking at the full pregnancy. Yes.
Small question. So how is birth weight measured contemporaneously with wildfires, or is it like wildfires lag?
So it's
are those lag a couple of months or something like that, or it's the
it's basically we know the period of gestation, and it's if a wildfire happened during the gestation, then we classify the mother as one. And by the trimester, that would be this happened in the first trimester or second trimester and so on. Yeah. And looking at the SES heterogeneity, in this case, we didn't observe much of a difference, also in line with some other studies. So it seems that low education, they have a larger effect size, but then the confidence intervals are overlapping. The differences are not statistically significant between groups, both for the two outcomes. We also looked at preterm birth as a possible other outcome for SES differences, but also in that case, we didn't observe a lot. Yes.
Stop. Did you use another measure for SES instead of education, say income or another type of?
So we don't have income. We tried other types of educational proxies, like highest level of education between the parents, because we have also father's education, and also the patterns were similar. Something that we haven't tested, but I was thinking about yesterday is occupation, because maybe so there is it's a bit tricky to use because you don't know if the stated occupation of the mother, because in some cases they might say that they are not working, but maybe they are just not working because of the maternal leave. So in that there is some noise in the measure, but it could be tested in that sense, because maybe if you're working, you're more likely to still go out and be exposed. So that could be check. And so as I was showing at the beginning the map of the wildfire in Chile, you could see that the wildfire happened in close to Valparaiso, but the smoke spread out. So it's not something that happens in a municipality and then you have only that location that is negatively affected by the impact. So then the measure that we are using in this main analysis might be noisy. And the idea then was, what else can we do to measure the impact of wildfire exposure? And in this case, a lot of research is looking at wildfire-related PM2.5 exposure. So there are new types of, let's say, models that leverage the factor that we have these satellite maps of the smoke plumes, and we have also the area that has been burned. And we have also meteorological information on the wind, for example. And also there are specific types of meteorologists developing some chemical transport modeling that can approximate how much of the air pollution in a specific area would have been determined by this wildfire. And they provide these types of data for many different regions of the world. So we leverage a data set like this for the European context and specifically for Spain. And there is lots of researchers now using these kinds of data set. And the main advantage is that in this case, we are not looking at the exposure to in the municipality of the wildfire, but we can also understand how much the air pollution is moving around and affecting also people close by. Because air pollution moves can move quite far away, as in the picture was observed. But for the context of, let's say, birth outcomes specifically, we are not then capturing very well the impact of stress, because in this case, we would capture very well air pollution, but stress is less well proxied, let's say, by this measure. And also, I mean, these models that create the measure of air pollution are quite sophisticated, but still they're based on some assumptions and might not still capture very well the exposure to air pollution. But still, here we leverage this data, and we computed then during pregnancy anomaly days of PM2.5 from wildfires. So this is not PM2.5 from other sources, only from the wildfire that happened. And we basically computed the mean in a specific month, and then created anomalies from this mean. So if an anomaly was low, it was classified as low. If the amount of PM2.5 was below 5 micrograms per cubic meter, medium 5 to 10, and then high if above 10 micrograms per cubic meter. And to give like a threshold, the WHO threshold for healthy PM2.5 was 10 until 2019, but they changed it to 5 because they still in studies could observe a negative impact above 5. So nowadays, a good level of PM2.5 is below 5. In many, not so many places in the world, they have this very good air quality. So, for example, in Italy, in Italian context, 90% of the country has a higher levels than this, than the 5. But looking then at the impact of PM2.5 by the 3 trimesters. So here it's having one extra day with the low, medium, or high exposure to air pollution. And we observe that it seems to affect not only the third trimester, but in all trimesters. Here the outcome is birth weight. And the main impacts are observed with medium, high exposure to anomalies. It might be related to the fact that high is not so often that it happens. Most of the exposure is medium. So that might be related to the fact that the exposure, the results are more identified for the 3 trimester there. But it seems that it's affecting in all trimesters. And this seems to be the same also for low birth weight, even though here the results are a bit more noisy compared to birth weight as an outcome. We also tested some other alternative measures of wildfire exposure. So in the main analysis, I looked at big, large wildfires. We looked also at small wildfires, so below 500 hectares. And this did not seem to be affecting outcomes there. We also used a proximity-based measure. So we looked at the center of the location of the center of the wildfire and the center of the municipality, or to better approximate distance in terms of like where the mother could be living and where the wildfire could be the most dangerous. And it seems to basically support the results from the other studies. So being closest to the wildfire is the leading to the highest impact. And then in this analysis, we use the European data. There is also Spanish data from the Ministry for Ecological Transition and Demographic Challenge that they basically provide the locations of the wildfires that mostly, I think, the firefighters that give them, and then try to use this data as well. It's not satellite based, but it's more like the people going there telling where it is located. And we observed similar results to using the satellite-based measures. So some of the limitations of these studies are the fact that we cannot really test if the main drivers of these impacts are related to stress or, for example, air pollution. And also the SCS patterns we observe as in other studies that there seems to be no clear SCS gradient in this case. And we cannot test why that's the case, or if maybe there are different mechanisms that then cancel each other out in terms of like inequality. And yeah, exposure assessment, there is a measurement error. We try to test different measures of wildfire exposure to better approximate for that. And a big factor here is that we have big municipalities, but we don't have the rural areas that might be those that are affected the most, even though numbers are smaller in terms of births. Would be interesting also to have data on this, but it's not easy to access. And yeah, in future studies would be interesting then to disentangle these processes, like understand what's the driver between stress and air pollution. It's not easy because also data to do that would be not easy to get access to, but would be quite interesting. And also here we focused on birth outcomes, but there is also space to do other types of research and understand, for example, how wildfires affect displacement and migration. Now, with a colleague of mine, we're trying to understand then displacement, especially in Spain, how this affects, how this is working, and then also mortality could be also one to focus on, especially driven by this exposure to air pollution. And yeah, as I was saying before, there is lots of research on the US, Brazil, but not so much in other contexts. And we didn't observe a pattern when it comes to socioeconomic status as a driver, but maybe it is an important factor in other contexts that also then therefore would need to broaden the research scope to other geographical contexts. And yeah, so basically to conclude, here we observe that wildfires increase the risk of low birth weight and decreased birth weight. And looking at the exposure to the wildfire location, this seems to mostly happen in the third trimester, but when looking at air pollution, this seems to happen regardless of the trimester. Heterogeneity, we don't observe it much. And the question here is it because everyone is affected similarly? Is it because people don't know that they maybe should stay more inside when there is higher air pollution due to wildfires, and this determines that there is no impact here? Or or it's something that's less easy to prepare for. And the contribution in this case is to look then at the European context that was not researched before, and also provide more evidence on socio-demographic disparities. And in terms of like implications, we know that when wildfires happen, there should be more information and healthcare support for the mothers that are exposed to this type of natural disaster. And thanks a lot, and I look forward for your comments and questions.
Really interesting. I have a question about the SES patterns. I was wondering if you thought about looking at the municipality SES or some proxy for like the level of resources that the municipality might have. Thinking especially about the last things that you mentioned in terms of future research, kind of information gaps between different municipalities and their resources, or whatever policies they have to lessen the impacts of the wildfires or to help people move or get informed. If you have any of that data, you could look at.
And it's a good point. we were also thinking about how to do that. And at the beginning, we were thinking about the policy related to management of forests. I don't know how that could be proxy. Like, but for heat, now in Spain they have a heat health action plan, so it's easy to understand which municipalities are more protected by this, because in that context they set a limit of how hot it can becomes in a specific area, and that area became like a problematic area, no? But for wildfires, we're still thinking about it. Like also when it comes to people acting about it, there is no clear understanding on how this works. But for certain outcomes, it seems like what air pollution from wildfires has an increasing impact, the higher the air pollution from it, or the larger the wildfire. But then at some point, it starts to either decline or stay constant, no, or it doesn't go up again. And there are many explanations for that. It's not clear yet, but it's either because once the wildfire becomes really big, then you start to act. So if it's medium, maybe see it. If it's far away, you know air pollution is there, but maybe don't act for it. No? But maybe if it's very large, then you move away, or you stay more inside. No, as for example with the big wildfire that affected the US, that they were staying more inside in New York and so on because of that. So in that case, you take protective action. But if it's like more milder, maybe you don't. But these are still it's still a open question. So so we need to find out a good proxy for the municipality adaptive capacity to that. That could be simple as GDP per capita, but I don't know how much that could be a factor, or maybe resources to protect from wildfires. And that's a good point.
So following up on that, can we get data on the resources of the municipality, not the GDP per capita of the people who live there, but the budget, for example, for the municipality?
So like related to conservation of natural areas or something like that.
Probably, but if you don't have that, probably it's highly correlated with the total budget of municipality, right?
Maybe. So I think maybe one thing with wildfires is that when they happen, you get help from other places, no? Or even other countries. No? For example, now in Greece there was a big wildfire in close to Athens, and from France they were sending people to help out. So it could be one still relevant thing, but I don't know how it will conflict with people from other places going to help.
I think I was also getting at not at specifically the resources for managing the wildfire, but just like the general resources. For example, like the level of healthcare they have, kind of the community building that they have in general, just like general resources that might help people get more information or get like shelter or
Infrastructure.
Right,
yeah, infrastructure in general.
And so healthcare facilities, things like that.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Well, social facilities. Instead of, in terms of protection, like if they leave, for instance, if they lose their houses, they can move somewhere else to a shelter. Be protected. I have an extra question. Thinking about the occupation. So I was wondering whether do you have information about unemployed, if people are unemployed, or for instance, like the mom were at home, taking care of their pregnancy, instead of being working, something like this, like to be inside, your house when the wildfire happens, and you have resources, you can stay inside, you are not in the the vicinity of the wildfire. But if you are in the middle of the wildfire, you have to move out, right?
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you can basically have some information about that. And maybe I'm going to say something very stupid, but it's just thinking about Valparaiso situation.
Yeah.
normally in Chile, wildfires happen in hilly situations. It's not on the coast or in plain areas. So I might consider that in terms of like your you mentioned by the end of the presentation that you were considering something like the proximity of the wildfire, but it's different when you live on a hill, than when you live on a plain area. So I was wondering if there is any kind of correlation with hilly situation in terms of wildfire, and something like when it happens, on urban area, that might you take that in consideration.
Starting with the first question. So like, with the SES, we have different classifications of the type of occupation. So, it's broad categories. If they are not employed, or if they are employed in more, for example, agriculture, or more in service sector and so on. So it could be proxies of, like, for example, some people employed in agriculture more likely to be going out still. In that sense, And then, the hilly situation, I think also in the Spanish context, like in the northwest where there were many, or also in the east, close in Catalonia where this happened a lot, are more mountainous areas. And so the proximity, like, analysis here was like, instead of looking at exposure in the municipality, because what could happen is that the municipality is big and the wildfire happened at the top of it, but most of the people live in the south. So we don't have the location of residence of the mother, but we know where is the location in the municipality with more people living there. So, and we used the center of that area as as the point related to the center of the place where the wildfire happened. So in that way, we have the distance between the people in that municipality and also in the people in the municipalities close by, because the municipality is also bordering with other municipalities. And it might be that we allocate exposure to that municipalities, but most of the people in the close municipalities live closer to that. So we use that to approximate for these possible problems there. But that's the best we could do in that sense. To get
Do you have any measure of, I'm thinking of stress, like some measure of how destructive the fire is for people? Because of, in a big area, maybe the fire was very far, so it destroyed a lot of land, but not houses. So, because I'm thinking that pollution may be one thing, but after all, babies don't need, that's going to damage the lungs of the mother, but babies in blood, like they are in gestation. So if it is a stress, then, if the fire is worse for people, do you have any measure of how terrible it is for people?
So the main measures that are in data are like how much land it burned, the type of land, so the type of, if it was agricultural land or forests, and it might be also to type of, if there were like buildings, things like this. And then another measure of, let's say, intensity is then how many days it lasts. So you have 1, 2, 3, up to 30 days. Of how many days it was there. The problem with the days is that maybe at the beginning it's small, then it intensifies the third day, then it goes down. So it's difficult to understand if it really capture how bad it was.
But
that might be the
It's a proxy of population. If I understand correctly, you are thinking about how populated were the area affected by the wildfire. As compared to something that
I would like to know how many houses were burned.
exactly,
Right.
yes, that will be the idea of the question. In comparison to something that wildfire that affected mostly like an empty, land. Something like that.
Yeah.
But you can say that the municipality takes effect capture this kind of characteristics.
Yeah, that's case.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question that focuses on your independent variable, air pollution, in this case, wildfire. Because sometimes when we try to estimate the effects of environmental variable on individuals, we need to control for climate variables like the level of rain, the level of air speech. So in this case, beyond the community physical effects, you control for another variables,
Yeah, temperature we had as a control variable.
but the level of rain, because in this case, sometimes the level of rain reduce the concentration of air pollution. That is important if you want to reduce the air immersion in your air pollution variable.
Yeah, like in this, in the air pollution variable that we use should be accounting for the meteorological factor, because I think it's constructed using also wind speed and so on. So I think in that case, it should, to a certain extent, limit the bias there. So, but adding other control variables, for example, precipitation could be an idea also.
Yeah, I got a comment, so I'm a little uneasy with the two-way fixed effect specification, because basically you're comparing units that are treated in some points in time with the same units that are not treated in some other points in time. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. I'm just saying this is more like a complementary kind of analysis that could try to grasp better the effect of the treatment. So perhaps using some subset of the data and using a more like regression discontinuity approach or a difference in difference approach, where you basically build up a control group that hasn't been exposed, like the 7 municipalities or the women from municipalities that haven't been exposed in the last 5 years or 10 years or so to wildfire. And then, and as you know, what happens later, and then compare those with the breathways that occur right after the fire, the wildfires in those specific municipalities. So the treatment is switched from off to on just once. So you can see that what happens when there's like you can clear up instead of using like fixed effects and control variables, you can narrow down to the specific variation associated to the treatment, which is the wildfire. That'd be like more of a regression discontinuity kind of approach, I think.
In that case, you would just focus on one wildfire. Or
Well, we would have to focus on one wildfire. You would have a lot of municipalities, but basically, like municipalities who've never experienced a wildfire, at least like 5-10 years or so. And so, and then compare basically reduce the amount of points in time, not the amount, and reduce somewhat the amount of municipalities, so they achieve this requirement, but basically see how the variation in birth weight before and after the treatment. Because I get the two-way fixed effects, combines units that were exposed and not exposed at different points in time. So that's a little bit confusing to me. Instead, there would be like this would be a more like narrowed down, straight, clear-cut estimate of or mitigation strategy.
So yeah, like looking at the literature, also looking at the main effects here, like this effect size, it was a paper on Australia looking at one big wildfire. So they focus only on one. And in that case, they it's like picking, you pick, I like this one, and then I studied this for this population. In a way.
It has to be very sorry.
But in this case, we thought
complementary strategy.
right.
Then replacing what you have. It's like we have this is like it's the full data, it's all there is, but there still might be some limitations in the ability to identify causal effects. Instead, then you go to a more narrowed down strategy, which is going to be like more internal validity at expense of external one.
Right. It's also like in terms of how many municipalities are actually affected. There are not that many, because you can see that in this map I have all the wildfires, about 500 hectares that had happened between 2008 and 2021. So it's in a way not very common event. Like the proportion of mothers in the data that have been affected by it, it's not very big.
And especially the large ones. How many large ones do you observe?
But I don't know how many in terms of the number, but yeah, they are all the ones in the map. I don't know. I don't remember now the count, but it's not like it's still quite many happening. But from the 3.5 million individuals happening, like exposed, it's not a very big proportion. Like if you compute the absolute increase of let's say newborns with the low birth weight, with the effect size that I was saying before, it doesn't get more than 1,000, let's say, total. So it's not a lot, but still at population level, also in the California case, they find similar patterns. So that's why actually in the literature now there is more a focus on estimating the air pollution related to wildfire. So lots of studies now, they focus on that rather than other measures of exposure that are related to the location. So that's also why we were inspired of like looking at only air pollution as such as well. And then the different type of analysis is more common when it comes to the migration. And what they do there, studies, is that they have there is one paper for the US in which they have by neighborhood, so zip codes basically. They know the zip code that was affected by it, and then they compare them with the neighborhoods just around. And in that case, you can estimate the impact of that. The problem with this data is that I mean, there are some municipalities that have other municipalities neighboring, but not all of them. So, and this difference in different studies is something that we plan to do for the displacement study, because in that case we have all of Spain. We can really like focus on that municipality and also those neighboring ones. But for the type of data here, we thought it was more, let's say, fitting the type of setting to look at in this way. So that was the main reason for not doing a different day for. But there could be an additional analysis. They're really focusing on one of the biggest ones.
Exactly. So the other thing I was thinking about, I do a lot of like survey related research. So is another that could try to go towards after the mechanism is finding out if there's surveys that were fielded during the fireworks. So I'm thinking like the pre-post quasi-experimental design where you have some field work and the wildfire hits right in the middle. So you can compare like like typical indicators that perhaps are available in the surveys. It's a long shot, but it could go what you're after, basically. Like satisfaction, some kind of depressive symptom, battery, or something like that. Like the CSI in Spain kinds of do a lot of those kind of surveys, and they basically they feel like monthly surveys, I guess, or so there could be perhaps something there that could track down.
Well, like one study looked at mechanisms in stress. They were looking at, they had data on mother and if they were smoking. I don't know how accurate was that, and then they was finding they were smoking more because of being exposed to. I don't know. Usually you're not supposed to smoke, but they were not finding that still. And then they were explaining it with that. But in this case, I don't know if it's possible to get still municipality level data. Would be the problem. Maybe it's not the same unit of not the same people. Maybe it's still informative, but
Yeah, it would have to be a large survey at least.
Yeah. So now something that I looked at some time ago is that in Europe there is this Eurobarometer, and that they ask questions to people about different things. They have also one on climate change and how concerned you are. So in, let's say, northwest of Spain, but mostly Portugal, there was this big wildfire in 2017 that even the Pope talked about, for example. No? And with this Portuguese colleague, we were looking at the data on the Eurobarometer, and you really see that people asked about climate change in this questionnaire before the event. It was rated quite low. Concerned, yes, but not very concerned. No? With this wildfire, you see that there's an increased spike, but it lasts for maybe 1 year, and then you see that it goes back to the same level as before. You know? So it seems that, yeah, these events raise our awareness of the topic, but it's short-lived oftentimes. Then you need to wait for another wildfire.
Repeated exposure.
Then they have this theory of the boiling frog, no? That this summer is hot, and you say, it's so hot this summer. Next summer, it's hot again. It was hot last year, it's hot again. So you get accustomed. So let's say. So stop the.
Sí. Yes.
Yes.